Russia teeters on the brink of complete collapse. Its economy is crumbling, its industries failing, and its people growing increasingly restless, desperate, and incensed at the deteriorating state of their nation. Now, even Russia's own experts are sounding the alarms, predicting the very real possibilities of civil war, political breakdown, and complete chaos all across the country. And like a sinking ship that's taken on too much water, there's nothing that can stop the imminent, miserable demise of this once proud nation. Those who've been following the situation in Russia closely in recent times will already be aware of the countless problems facing the country today. These issues are discussed at length and on a recurring basis by Western journalists, media outlets, and military analysts. In Russia, however, the tone tends to be very different. There, newspapers, TV stations, and expert officials are often ordered, instructed, or otherwise pressured to toe the Kremlin line, to parrot Putin's propaganda, deny the facts, and twist the narrative however they can to paint Russia in the best possible light at all times. It's been seen time and time again during the course of the war so far. When Russia suffers any sort of military defeat or embarrassing loss, it gets glossed over. When it has a minor gain on the ground, it gets exaggerated. Over and over, Russia's officials and media outlets spin the story to suit their own ends, controlling public opinion through lies and falsehoods, never daring to admit that things are going badly or that their all-powerful leader, Vladimir Putin, might have made a mistake. Slowly but surely, however, that's starting to change. Earlier this year, Russian officials in positions of power and authority began openly owning up to the major problems facing their nation. Elvira Nabiullina, for example, the governor of the Russian Central Bank, announced at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum back in June that Russia's economy was running out of resources. Around the same time, at the same event, the country's economy minister, Maxim Reshetnikov, admitted that Russia was on the verge of a transition to recession. Even the Russian Prime Minister, Mishustin, shared a grim assessment of the country's deteriorating financial situation in August, noting that most regional governors have struggled to fill their budgets for 2025. Adding that business profits are down, exports of important products have declined, and the economy is struggling to stay afloat. Now, another Russian expert is going much further, revealing the full, ugly extent of the numerous crises facing his country today, and calling for immediate action to prevent even more severe problems such as civil war and the dehumanization of Russian society. The expert in question is Alexander Kharichev, head of the Presidential Directorate for Monitoring and Analyzing Social Processes. Kharichev recently wrote an article for the Russian journal State, issued by the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration (RANEPA) and the project DNA of Russia. In that article, Kharichev outlined no fewer than 5 major challenges facing the nation today, and while some of his reasoning and responses to these issues are questionable, to say the least, he does still manage to make some salient points. Here's a closer look at the 5 challenges he highlights. First, population decline. Russia currently ranks as the 9th most populous nation in the world, with a grand total of almost 144 million people. Kharichev fears, however, that the country could slowly start to slip down the rankings in the future. His reasoning for this is in line with what one might expect of a Kremlin official. He claims that depopulation is the global problem caused by the impact of the globalist experiment, adding it's a virus affecting thinking with an inadequate and ill-conceived construct. He cites women in China as an example, claiming that women in large cities don't want to start families. They live their lives, satisfying their needs, pursuing a career. Closer to 30, they have a child with someone or with sperm taken from a donor bank. Single-parent families have become the norm. They have one child and they say that's enough. And the husband is an additional burden, having to wash socks and cook. He then goes on to blame people wanting to live child-free lives or being part of the LGBTQ community for causing the destruction of our people, before arguing that Russia should respond to these perceived threats by promoting traditional family values and making it more fashionable to have large families. He even believes that films should start being made featuring families with not just 1 or 2 children, but 3 or more, to encourage Russians to procreate. In reality, Russia may indeed face a depopulation problem, but it likely has little to do with the reasons Kharichev suggested. it may be more closely connected to the fact that the country has lost literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers, many of whom were young, able-bodied men who might have gone to start families of their own and contribute to society in other ways had the war never begun. Hundreds of thousands or more have been injured and will struggle to ever live normal lives, placing great strain on the country's healthcare services and other critical infrastructure. And an estimated million more Russians decided to leave their country of origin when the war began, either as an act of protest or out of fear for the future, their families, and their own lives. A Carnegie Politika report published in September 2025 also noted several other reasons behind Russia's ongoing demographic crisis. First, the country is now facing a deeper decline in the birth rate, a worsening age structure of the population, and various consequences of the war. Second, the main demographic shock absorber is disappearing, Russia's appeal to immigrants, who for 3 decades offset the natural population decline. The evidence backs this up. In 2024, just 1.22 million people were born in Russia, which is the lowest amount since 1999, and the number of births is expected to decline year on year by 3 to 5% until at least 2030. As the report notes, migration is also down, which is hardly surprising. In its current state, facing economic crisis, price hikes for everyday essentials, enormous inflation, and complete isolation from much of the rest of the world, Russia is hardly an appealing destination for those seeking a better life. Even people looking to leave less prosperous Central Asian nations behind have significantly superior options than Russia right now. So, rather than featuring bigger families in films, Russia might instead want to look at fixing some of its more fundamental issues. The second big challenge Kharichev identifies is what he calls the loss of sovereignty. He goes on to argue that the war in Ukraine has actually helped Russia preserve its sovereignty for the time being. The Russian elite was focused solely on sending their children to study abroad, creating retirement structures overseas. The richer ones, somewhere on the Côte d'Azur, the poorer ones in Montenegro. In other words, we were simply losing the elite. After some time, we would have completely lost our potential, economic, technological, and political. For Russia, the special military operation turned out to be a cleansing. Kharichev also notes that prior to 2022, around 70% of the graduates from Russia's top physics and mathematics schools went abroad to study, and very few ever returned, going on to argue that those fighting in Ukraine have helped to restore a sense of pride in the country, combined with a widespread rejection of globalization. He goes on to present his solution, which essentially revolves around promoting more patriotic attitudes among younger generations, in particular through what he calls patriotic education, but what the rest of the world might deem Kremlin-backed brainwashing in classrooms. As with the previous point, Kharichev's argument leaves much to be desired, but there's an undercurrent of truth to his core idea. Russia may very well lose its sovereignty as it's known today, but not for any of the reasons the expert outlined. It may instead come as a result of various Russian regions deciding to take back control of their lands and wrest power away from the Kremlin. There's been evidence of this in recent times, with small pockets of rebellion rising up across Russia, particularly in territories with indigenous populations who feel that they've been exploited and abused by the Moscow elites for too long. In some regions, like the Sakha Republic and Ingushetia, there are even whispers of separatist movements, with partisan groups, militias, and even elected officials calling for the kind of change not seen since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Kremlin's grasp on these regions and others is starting to slip, and modern Russia may very well no longer exist in the not-so-distant future. Kharichev's third challenge is the erosion of public trust in the government. This one is relatively easy to understand, as it's a perfectly natural, rational consequence of the Russian government's actions over the last few years. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, many Russians may have had their own personal reservations about their president and the rest of his Kremlin cohorts, but many also felt he was the right man to lead their country forward despite his flaws. He had overseen the nation since the turn of the millennium, and people had seen certain aspects of their lives improve under his leadership. Since the war, however, attitudes have most certainly started to shift. Many Russians are fearful of speaking out against the Kremlin or openly criticizing Putin for fear of reprisals, given the government's strict stance on acts of protest or dissent. But all the signs are there to show that large parts of the population no longer trust or believe in Putin, and many would secretly like to see him removed from power. This was evidenced by the thousands upon thousands of people who lined up all day long to attend the funeral of Putin's late political opponent, Alexei Navalny, as well as the countless Russians who have defied the Kremlin's laws and gone out onto the streets marching, waving signs, and sharing their disdain for the country's leadership and its warmongering ways, everywhere from St. Petersburg in the west to Vladivostok in the Far East. These protests have only become more intense in recent times, as people go increasingly sick and tired of a war that many of them never wanted to begin with, and that so many are desperate to see come to an end. And much of their anger is directed at Putin himself, along with the other officials and elites who allow the bloodshed to continue. A recent poll of the Russian people, carried out by the Levada Center, collected even more evidence of this, with 2/3 or 66% of Russians stating in no uncertain terms that the time is right for peaceful negotiations and a ceasefire, while just 27% of respondents felt that the fighting should continue. Increasing numbers of Russians also say that their lives, and those of their loved ones, are being impacted by the conflict, with some suffering the losses of friends or family members, others suffering breakdowns in family relationships, and others still dealing with financial and other personal losses associated with the war. In the face of increasing anger, dissent, and frustration, Putin cuts an increasingly weak, isolated, and unpopular figure. He no longer has the enormous levels of support he once enjoyed from the millions of people across his vast nation. And while he's still one of the most powerful individuals in the world, capable of manipulating elections and amending the constitution to suit his desires, he may not be able to get away with his usual tricks and tactics for too much longer. To stay in power, any leader, even a dictator, has to command the respect of his people, and Putin is undoubtedly losing that. To solve the problem of eroding trust in the government and state institutions, Kharichev suggested a meritocratic system in which leadership roles should be assigned to those who are most capable and qualified to fill them. It's an idea that would undoubtedly work well in countless other countries, but history has proven that modern-day Russia has no interest in these sorts of systems. In Putin's Russia, power is given and taken by one man and one man only, and those in the highest positions of authority are most often those who show him the most loyalty, not necessarily the ones best qualified for the jobs in question. The fourth big crisis facing Russia is what Kharichev calls dehumanization and transhumanism of the Russian people. He argues that too many Russians are following what the Kremlin would classify as capitalist Western lifestyles, becoming obsessed with technology and the internet, retreating into the virtual world for their own comfort and convenience rather than contributing more meaningfully and actively to society. He fears that too many people are becoming subjects of consumption, writing, "We need patriots, not couch potatoes, but active people, ready to take responsibility for themselves, their families, and their country." To solve this problem, Kharichev again speaks about the importance of educating the younger generations and the people of the future about traditional values and ethics. He suggests that Russia makes it its mission to instill what he feels are vital elements into the next generations, like patriotism, teamwork, family values, traditional moral norms, solidarity, and contribution through creative work and service. Again, this problem is arguably another of Russia's own making. The world is changing. Technology has connected countries and people like never before, and younger generations of Russians growing up today may have very different views and values from those that came before them. The same can be said of many other countries around the world, but while others embrace change and attempt to guide and nurture new generations, while also learning from them, Russia's answer appears to instead revolve around trying to train some sort of robot generation to behave exactly as the Kremlin expects. But the more the country attempts to control and push its people around, particularly those in younger age brackets, the more likely they may very well be to rebel or even retreat from the country altogether, fleeing like so many others have before, starting anew somewhere else and contributing to some of the other issues Kharichev mentioned earlier on, like depopulation. Kharichev's fifth crisis is arguably the most worrying one of all. He predicts that, due to increasing divisions and conflicts across Russian society, due to social, economic, cultural and political issues, the country could very well face a full-scale civil war sometime in the future. The very fact that a Russian official could suggest something like this so openly just goes to show how dire the situation has become. Only a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable for a leading Russian sociologist like Kharichev to talk of civil war in the country. Now, it's a statement that hardly raises an eyebrow because it's completely and utterly true. divisions are spreading across Russia, and tensions are rising. Talks of separatist movements and rumblings of rebellion in certain regions have already been mentioned here, along with angry protests, marches and demonstrations in even the biggest and wealthiest Russian cities. The people are angrier than they've been in decades, and with some partisan groups and militia forces already taking active action against the Russian regime, it may not take all that much to ignite a much larger conflict. Indeed, the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center suggested the increasingly real possibility of civil war as one of the 5 likeliest scenarios facing Russia in the years to come. Indeed, it's civil war, a scenario that's increasingly easy to envision, especially as the twin failures of Ukraine and the economy continue apace. Perhaps in Chechnya, an increasingly unhealthy Ramzan Kadyrov dies in office, and infighting over a successor spirals into a third Chechen war. Perhaps in Tatarstan, veterans committees and local students gather to protest both Moscow's recruitment of Tatar infantry and smothering of Tatar identity. And the Kremlin, in a fit of failed strategy, opens fire on the protesters, sparking a broader anti-colonial movement in Tatarstan. Or perhaps in Sakha, unemployed Sakha men storm and seize control of Russian hydrocarbon infrastructure, demanding the funds be returned to their colonized nation and demanding the sovereignty they agreed to in the early 1990s. Any one of these incidents, or dozens of others, could be the spark that sets Russia's increasingly towering pile of tinder ablaze, potentially leading to the toppling of the Putin regime, the end of the war with Ukraine, and a complete transformation of the Russian Federation into something far different from what it is today. Kharichev, meanwhile, doesn't go into too much detail about what might cause a civil war or how it could play out, but instead argues that Russia needs to work on building a more cohesive, unified society. That's far easier said than done, especially now with such intense and widespread anger and with so many different contrasting viewpoints and positions among Russia's many regions and diverse peoples. And there's one final challenge Kharichev didn't mention, but that's still highly pertinent to Russia right now: its ongoing economic crisis. Because money is often at the root of almost all major problems facing a nation, Russia included, and money is something that the Kremlin is rapidly losing control of. The Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine, SCRU, recently revealed exactly how bad the situation is becoming in a November 5 report. According to its assessment, close to 40% of all Russian enterprises are facing payment delays, which is a huge increase from the figure of 25% from this time last year. Demands for goods and services has also dropped for 34% of businesses, and 32% of them face liquidity shortages. Logistical problems plague Russia's businesses too. The SCRU notes that 15% of companies are reporting disruptions, which is a notable increase from the 10% from earlier this year. 68% of firms are having to cut expenses like admin costs and service expenditure in order to cope with the challenges, with another 15% suspending their investment and expansion plans. Russian business leaders say the situation is difficult and uncertain, and many have little confidence or hope that the situation will improve anytime soon. The weight of all these issues combined is clearly proving to be far too great for Russia to bear. Its government appears lost and confused. Its economy is only going to get worse, and its people are paying the price for decisions beyond their control, day in and day out. The country's collapse is no longer imminent. It's already begun. The only question now is, how low will Russia sink before something huge happens to turn the tide? Which could include the start of a civil war, the end of the conflict in Ukraine, or even the overthrowing of the Putin government. Now, learn more about how Putin's power is slipping through his fingertips in this video, which explores how even the Russian president's puppet regimes have started to turn against him. Or watch this video to see how sabotage, separatist movements, and Ukraine covert operations are wreaking havoc on Russia from the inside. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our trusted channel too, for more military breaking news, insightful breakdowns of key conflicts across the globe, and other informative factual video reports you won't want to miss.